problem. I'm like, oh, have I read this one yet? Because I don't remember. And I've also read aloud for some like pre-recorded things and
Mm.
audiobooks, so I can't remember what I read for. And I was trying to track it down, and I was like remembering your work, and I was like, okay, this is what I read alongside your work. I think I can remember, but I'm pretty sure it's different.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah,
think
I remember, Melissa, yours is the one about guns, right? And
Yeah,
then
yes.
Athena, yours is one about being on the plane.
yeah, so I'm reading something different then.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, last time I read something that was more personal. It's like a memoir essentially, and this time I was like, oh, it got more reported. So mostly to, I think, amuse myself more than anyone else.
Yeah.
It's cool that you've got like the option though to like kind of pick like different flavors of things to pull from. I mean, it's the same with essay collections too, right? I mean, you can kind of like bounce around and choose different kind of things. It's really cool.
Yeah. And like depending on like what happened that day in the world and like what mood we're in sort of communally and what like I'm feeling that day, I'm like, there have been days that I've had a plan and then just scrapped it. Like that doesn't feel right today, or, so.
Yeah, I went
Welcome to everyone. Oh, sorry, Athena, hold on one second. Let's just say welcome to everyone coming in. We'll be getting started in just a minute. You're getting a glimpse into the green room here. This is just backstage. It's happening on stage. All right, Athena, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say after our last reading, I was like, I want to start trying to write something that has a little bit more like reporting in it. So the piece that I'm working on now is like kind of a direct result of that last reading that we had.
That's so cool.
Kind of because it's like completely different than what I'm used to writing. So like, let me try to see how this works out. So thank you for the inspiration.
Cool.
That's really cool.
Love the reportage and sort of like more personal combination. That's one of my favorite things.
Me too. I love the reported essay also because when you do the reporting, that's less you have to write, so it's like you bring in the outside perspective and other people's intelligence, and it almost feels like it's cutting a corner. So
totally. You're like, okay, now I have to just sort of connect these dots. And like, sometimes that just means a sentence or two of like, okay, how do I transition that into the sort of like personal thread or responding to it in some way. I really like that process.
I get that question a lot though in classes where students will want to know, well, like how do you decide like what to research in a way? The desire will be from reading essays that have research elements in it. They'll be like, well, I want to do that. And I'm so curious, like, how do you know what to research, or if you should research, or if you're just writing like a piece of like straight up memoir? I'm sorry, we're in the Q&A already.
It's my favorite part. So I mean, go ahead. No, Angela, you go. You're more of a researcher and reporter. So
yeah, I think for me, my background is just I've been a reporter for so long. I've been on staff at magazines and newspapers, and so when I start, even if I'm writing memoir, I always think there is an expert out there who has thought about this very carefully, especially because I used to talk to a lot of academics because I did a lot of science reporting. And so, maybe my essay will be about forgiveness and it's something very personal about my life, but then I'll be like, there's definitely a philosopher who's written about the philosophy of forgiveness, right? I'm clearly not the only person who has thought this through, and there are people who have thought it through very systematically. And so for me, it feels very natural to do that, in part because it's such an outgrowth of what I do for my day job, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like, I was just writing a thing recently and I kept coming back to this one element. It was a personal sort of story, but I kept coming back to this one thing, and it was for a talk, this like kind of unscripted talk that I had to give actually on Tuesday. And I kept coming back to like this one sort of peripheral subject. And I was like, why am I so obsessed with this subject? And I sort of realized that I didn't know that much about the background. And I was like, okay, I need to research this. So then I researched that subject. And then what always happens, which is like the coolest part, is that I find out all of these other details that I can connect to my story and not like have these awesome like aha moments where I'm like, oh, perfect. That, so it's usually when I like, I'm fixated on something, but I don't know that much about it. And then I'll usually end up going down a rabbit hole and I will research too much and then have to like pull myself back and be like, now we need to stop and keep writing.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say before we get to the actual reading part of it is, for me, one thing I've realized is, I'll hit a part in an essay where I don't know what more to write, and I'll feel like it's because my experience was shallow. Like maybe there's not enough to write about this thing that happened. But then oftentimes when that hits, I think it's actually because I haven't researched enough. And if I think more about what the themes are and doing that research, I think that actually brings me more clarity.
Oh, that's a very cool thing to hear, right? Like if you've kind of hit that wall, maybe you need to cast wider. That's really cool. Athena, did you have any thoughts to add before we?
I'm like the rookie of this because most of the things that I write are like straight memoir. But in the few things that I have done, it really has been using that research as a bolster to the actual memoir portion of what I'm writing. So I think I mentioned in our last reading together that I had an essay about learning how to shoot. And so that essay itself had elements of research in it, just kind of very, very practical numbers and facts and information that bolstered the idea of me in the emotional way of learning how to shoot. And I think it's what I'm trying to do now is I think that I'm seeing, okay, I can tell the emotion of it. Now, how do I kind of get the logical and the analytical in there as well? So that's what it is. It's just like a bolster to everything else that I'm writing.
That's very cool. Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you all to like be open to starting the Q&A before the event. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brian Gresco. Welcome to the Antibody. This is a quarantine reading series, part of LitHub's virtual book channel. I'm really happy to be with you guys tonight here in my big red chair in my writing studio in Brooklyn. The past 2 weeks have felt incredibly fast and yet like unfathomably long and full. And the next few weeks feel very tender. It feels like a very tender time. So I hope that everyone out there has a plan for how and when you're gonna vote. Please vote and please be safe and take care of yourself because this bastards just wanna grind us down. That's their plan. So don't let them. I continue to turn off the news some nights and listen to music, and I try as much as possible to put my phone down and pick up a book. And I see a lot of familiar names out there. So I know that if you know me, then you know that I'm a nonfiction fiend. And so I'm very excited to have 3 fantastic nonfiction authors with us tonight. Angela Chen is here, Athena Dixon is here, and Melissa Faliveno is here. And as you were coming in, you probably heard them sharing some of their wisdom and thoughts on their craft already. Before we open ourselves up, though, to hearing their words and their reading, I hope you'll join me in just settling yourself in comfortably with a deep breath. Because physically, you are where you are, and I'm here. But for the next hour or so, we are in this shared intellectual space together. And while we are, I ask that you please keep your mic muted. We don't have a stage, but we do have a mic, and we're going to honor the authors when they have it, as each author is going to read for us for a little bit. And then at the end, there'll be some time for Q&A. So be ready for that. I know there's a lot of writers in the audience. So if you've got craft questions, bring them because you're in the presence of experts tonight. The chat's public, so you can show your appreciation of the authors, and please show your appreciation for the authors often and enthusiastically. Our first reader of the evening is Angela Chen. Angela is a journalist and writer in New York City. Her reporting and criticism have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The Guardian, P, Electric Literature, Catapult, and elsewhere. Angela is a member of the ACE community and has spoken about asexuality at academic conferences and events, including World Pride. Please, everyone, get your keys clicking and your fingers tapping, and give a warm welcome in the chat there to Angela Chen. Angela, the mic is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to read tonight from my book, ACE, which I recently published, and it is about the asexual community. And it is the first reported book on asexuality, which to me is both exciting and deeply disappointing because I feel like this should have been written long ago. So the book is a mixture of personal memoir, a lot of reporting and research. And the part that I'm going to read from tonight is one of the more reported parts, so not my story. And I don't think there's really anything in particular you need to know. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit because it's one of those chapters where you have, the personal story and then a bunch of research and explanation. You have the personal story again, but I'm just going to tell the personal story to make it more interesting. So this is about a man named Hunter. And the reason that I wrote about it in the book is because I feel like it shows an interesting aspect of the ace community, and one that I feel like isn't shown that much because it's about how asexuality intersects with religion. When Hunter was very young, his parents would take him to the local superstore and let him hang out the video game display while they bought groceries. One day, seeing that an older kid was already there playing the demos, Hunter asked if he could take a turn for 5 minutes. Yeah, right, the kid said, you'll hog it. No, Hunter insisted. I'm not lying because I'm a Christian. Religion was the beating heart of his childhood, and Hunter had not yet realized that Christians could lie too. His family prayed before every meal and attended church each Sunday, but the greatest source of moral pressure always came from Hunter himself. As a child, he had a strong moral sense, fortified by the teachings of the Bible. As he grew older, this turned into a form of scrupulosity that he would one day look back on with bemusement. No one talked about sex. During all those childhood Sundays, only a single sermon directly addressed sex, and that was a warning against temptation. Yet while nobody was talking about sex, everyone learned that sex was good, a gift from God, and a pleasurable reward so long as enjoyed only within marriage. Sex bound men and women together in a way that nothing else could, like a superior connection, Hunter says, a quality so notable that it could almost be seen. People became different around each other, more tightly integrated, like an unofficial marriage. Hunter longed for that connection and knew that God would provide if he remained chaste. To uphold his end of the bargain, Hunter began training himself to resist temptation, and in college picked up a book called Every Man's Battle that promised a system for staying pure. The gist of Every Man's Battle is that avoidance is the answer to the problem of lust. Readers are instructed to bounce your eyes, Hunter explains, which means immediately looking away from anyone who might trigger an impure thought. Visual repression starves the sexual appetite, supposedly. I totally bought into that, Hunter says, just telling myself not to look at people because you can't lust. In hindsight, it maybe brought me some harm in other ways because there was nothing sexual to begin with, so I was constantly looking away from strangers who happened to be attractive. Avoidance was easy for Hunter, ridiculously so. Lust was not as much of a struggle for him as it was for others. He did not consider that lust might not be a struggle at all, that he had invented a struggle because he was told he must have something to struggle against. Today, now that he has told old friends that he is asexual, they laugh and say it's not fair that he had no sexual urges to suppress. Hunter, they say, you had cheat codes the whole time. Let's see. The religious narrative that dominated Hunter's life warned to wait until marriage, but always running alongside that message was the simple, secular one. Sex is cool. Sex makes you cool. Compulsory sexuality told Hunter that he was naturally lustful. The cultural legacy of Playboy and coming-of-age movies like American Pie further taught Hunter that sex would take away his worries about being masculine enough. Watching American Pie, it was like, oh yeah, that kid was a loser, and he became the hero of the movie, and the catalyst for that was having sex. That's what I wanted, he says. I wanted sex on an intellectual level. I wanted everything that sex was supposed to bring me. Hetero and white and male, the very model of privilege, Hunter nevertheless felt enormous pressure to be different from how he was. The way that compulsory sexuality intersected with gender expectations and religious teachings would be the source of much of his pain. His faith was strong, but the dictates of faith couldn't obliterate the message that real men are sexually aggressive. The promises of faith trumped the temptation of being cool. So Hunter and his girlfriend followed every precaution. No rooms with closed doors, no fooling around, and no sex until they married when Hunter was 25. Sex was nothing like Hunter had expected. I'd always heard people saying that, oh, one thing leads to another, but that was not it, he says. Sex felt forced and unnatural. Not forced as in non-consensual, more like he had to force himself to initiate. Not unnatural as in uncomfortable, but rather that it was unintuitive and he had to focus intently on the movements from moment to moment. Like learning to ride a bike, only your limbs never quite synchronized properly. Years of bouncing his eyes had not prepared Hunter for an act that was okay, but nothing special, nor had he expected his own indifference. Afterward, no special, superior connection materialized. Inexperience was the obvious culprit, but that explanation became less and less legitimate as the years went by. Age became the next scapegoat as Hunter wondered whether waiting until 25 had caused him to miss some kind of physiological trigger for enjoying sex. Every man's battle could be to blame, or maybe his religious upbringing more generally was at fault. Maybe the fact that no one talked about sex had made him oppressed, quote, almost like self-conversion therapy, but away from heteronormative sex. None of this explained why Hunter had Christian friends who married later and loved sex, saying it was their favorite part of marriage. He couldn't relate when coworkers joked about being thirsty and wanting to hook up, but he didn't mind hearing these stories either, so repression seemed unlikely. He hadn't been abused. He didn't have erectile dysfunction. A visit to the doctor to ask if everything was okay down there revealed that his testosterone levels were on the higher end of average. The doctor's visit had been Hunter's last resort. It provided no answer to a question that would not go away. His marriage was official in the eyes of the law, and his wife never complained. She was busy and didn't have a high sex drive anyway. But once again, the moral pressure came from Hunter himself. Because the sex never clicked, there was always this feeling that I was infantile, he says. He was not truly married, not truly an adult, and not truly a man. If sex is a gift from God, and wonderful if you do everything right, what does it mean when you do everything right and the sex disappoints time and time again? Where does that leave you? That's what brought me to the darkest places, Hunter says. I never experienced this great thing, and I didn't know why, for years on end, with no explanation. 9 years into his marriage, Hunter saw an article about asexuality on Facebook. It made asexuality sound like some medical problem, and the doctor's visit had busted that theory, so he closed the tab and moved on. A few months later, working the night shift at a factory, the term gray asexual in an Instagram bio caught Hunter's eye, and he casually Googled the term to learn more. By the end of the night, the interest was no longer casual. If asexuality wasn't about sickness, it might explain what theories about repression and out-of-whack hormones and religion had not. It might provide some measure of self-acceptance. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Angela. That was amazing. Everyone, if you show a little love in the chat for Angela Chen, that was awesome. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, that was so great. Thank you. The Antibody has a affiliate store via bookshop.org. Bookshop will direct your sale to the nearest independent bookstore, or if an independent bookstore isn't nearby, they will funnel part of your sale to one. And at the end of the year, any money raised through the affiliate program I'm going to donate to Black Lives Matter, and I will announce that figure on Twitter. So please support our authors and support independent bookstores. And you can find a link to purchase Angela's book, Ace, right here, along with all the other books from tonight's reading and from the entire season. So click away. Thank you again, Angela. That was awesome. Our next reader is Athena Dixon. Athena is a native of Northeast Ohio and is the author of The Incredible Shrinking Woman and No God in This Room. Her work appears in the Breakbeat Poets Volume 2, Black Girl Magic, and publications including Gay Magazine and Narratively. She is the co-host of the New Books in Poetry podcast, and Athena is joining us tonight from Philadelphia. Please welcome Athena Dixon. Show her some love in the chat. And Athena,
Hello.
Mike is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to be reading from my collection, The Incredible Shrinking Woman. And the piece that I'm going to read tonight is a personal essay titled Liturgy. And just the background of it is it's written in reference to my high school sweetheart who passed away in 2004. He was killed along with one of his family members in a car accident on the way to his grandmother's funeral. And so this is the first time since he passed that I actually have actually grieved him. So I wrote an essay about it. Liturgy. Justin is dead. My parents' phone number has been the same since before I was born. That's over 40 years of a stable landline that will always connect. It is a way station through which messages get passed, and it's how the news of Justin's death found me. A nameless person called my parents to pass along the grief. Standing at the window of my apartment, I hear my mother relaying the message that Justin is gone, and the phone is heavy in my hand, my fingers numb. My boyfriend hears me sobbing, but suddenly his arms are unable to hold me. They fall limp and useless at his sides. I am furious that all I need is someone to whisk me away from this, to shelter me from this call. But he stands there in his own shock, seeing his woman falling apart over another man. I'm sure he believes taking my heart back from a ghost is impossible, so he started to give up. He started his own disappearing. In some ways, he will never become solid again. What happens after my mother tells me my high school sweetheart is now a shell without a spirit is that I sink into the brown shag carpet and cry until I feel desiccated. I am 25 and living with a man who loves me and is gentle with my heart in the ways I've always wanted. Our lives are exactly what I envisioned, full of music, poetry, and friends. Justin seems like a lifetime ago, one in which things such as prom and mall dates were the entirety of the world. Before this call, I cannot remember the last time I've thought of him, but now he is there in a rush of what ifs and if only. Death is an intimate thing, but when you are close, the grief feels thicker. People understand this mourning because it's like a hole in the world. Everything gets swallowed up for a time before the landscape adjusts itself around that absence. It's different when you've been apart for a time before the loss. You feel as if your grief is less important. Your grief is like a ghost, hard to grasp and sometimes not believed. This kind of grief is like moving through fog, hands out, seeking something familiar. It's like a warning for something you're not sure you'll ever see. It makes you find ways to filter the lost person to perfect because that is easier than remembering what actually was. I would be remiss to tuck away the bumps in our road, no matter how easy it is to sweep them away for the sake of moralization. Justin was not perfect. No high school boyfriend is. I think my sadness comes from the not knowing. There is now no way to grow into what could have been. I can only take him as he was, and just maybe filtering out the bad is the quickest way to sweet memory. Yet sometimes things can be too sweet. That is when the bitter is important. I will need to remember the canceled prom plans the week before the dance, or the other girl who thought he was her own. I must remember that sometimes he could be cruel in his silence until I relented to what he wanted or what he needed me to believe to be true. But before my forgetting, I only needed to survive. After the call with my mother, I curl into a ball on the bedroom floor, trying to catch my breath as she offers comfort that I can no longer remember. The news of Justin's death pulls me back to the Robinson Youth Center basketball court where he first appeared, towering over the other boys, all gangly and new. It takes me back to our bodies pressed next to each other on a rumpus room floor, watching Martin G So Crazy on a massive TV. That call truncates the possibilities of our random reunions or the sound of his car pulling into my parents' driveway. Justin is dead. I don't know that only a few blocks away from my apartment, Justin's mother is shattering on a larger scale, trying to process the loss of her youngest son. It's been years since I've seen her, and I have no idea just how close my apartment is to his childhood neighborhood, or just how his pain stretches the blocks and shows up at our respective doorsteps. The sadness of his death is still too big to wrap around my heart, and it's sat like a stone in my belly ever since. I don't know how to digest it or how to swallow it down. Sometimes the whales threaten to break through. What I do after the funeral and its trauma is block out the memory of him to survive. Perhaps this forgetting is an ignoring of wants, needs, desires, and signs that things are never quite right. Maybe it's muscle memory to revert back to puppy love and forget that this is its own type of atrophy. Maybe his death ripped the sinew of my heart and the blackness of bruise is where I've hidden. Justin is dead. I'm not sure I've ever really said those words aloud, even if I know them to be true. When I say it for the first time, something in my brain breaks and I am back with numb fingers gripping a cordless phone. I'm back trying to clear the ringing in my ears and pull myself from the scratchy carpet. Before I know it, I'm crying as if the news is fresh. But there is no glitch in my brain that makes me believe Justin is the Tupac or Elvis of Northeast Ohio. There is no hologram version of him waiting in the wings to show up in military finery. I think if I say he is dead too loudly or too often, he will appear and haunt me in ways he hasn't since he left this earth. He will haunt me because I've managed to block out the sadness by replacing it with pain I've told myself is greater, pain that belongs to me because I've lived it. I tell myself that our lives have moved on before his death. There is another woman who deserves this grief, a child who is left without her father. He's been gone over 15 years. He seems like a dream, a specter of a boy I can't quite get out of my head. Justin is a ghost of a life that once was and what could have been. He haunts every bit of that time as a whisper at the edge of my memories I'm struggling to both hold on to and keep at bay. I've written about him in his casket and tried to comprehend just how his body fit inside that box, all 6 feet 6 inches of him. I've written about how his eyelashes look pressed against his cheeks. I know he is dead. I saw him with flags on either side of his casket, saw his brothers lining the front row. His obituary is paperclipped inside one of my long forgotten journals. I know he is dead because I can remember the ache in the center of my chest as I sobbed in my car. I know because I can still feel the tension in my jaw from trying to stop myself from screaming. I know because weeks later his mother called to thank me for the flowers. Justin is dead. I can't reconcile all that I have left of him as a singular photo of us rescued from a broken keychain. That photo is packed away from those times when I need to remember his face, or how his waves were always just right, or how he was actually a real person who once touched my skin. That day at the mall, cramped beside each other in the photo booth, we argued about which border to choose. I won, the flowers and pastel letters far from masculine. In the photo, I am not wearing my glasses because I thought I was cuter without them. So far in the future, that nearsighted haze is covering my memory of him like lichen on a tombstone. I want to be able to see his face without that picture. I don't want to dig through the boxes to find its smallness among the others. Justin is dead. He thought he was my first kiss. I never had the heart to tell him he wasn't. Our first kiss, commemorated with a picture of me he took from the back seat, was a rainy night in the summer. I'd stretched my body around the seat to meet his tallness barely contained in the space behind me. We'd kissed with my best friend steering us down a darkened back road towards his grandmother's home. Tupac or Biggie was storytelling in the background. Which one I can't recall. My best friend was always my wingman, even back when she'd ridden her bike full speed down the block to ask another boy if he liked me. And even when we lied to my aunt when borrowing her car and drove to Justin's hometown just so I could see him. I can't remember how Justin's lips felt against mine that night. I know they were not sloppy or too wet, and they didn't cover my mouth like a suction cup. My high school heart tells me it was perfect. Justin is dead. On my 21st birthday, he drove through a snowstorm to campus in the tiniest car I'd ever seen to take me for a drink. We sat at a bar, his uniform dappled with snow and my eyes weary from finals, sipping fuzzy nabels in silence. We'd broken up by then, but as he always said, I'm going to marry you one day. I wish I would have invited him to my dorm room so now I would have the memory of his body canopied above mine. I wish he would have been my first, if only for nostalgia's sake. Instead, Justin exists and pops in flashes when something triggers him to resurface. A mention of Germany or crackly phone calls that remind me of when he called from across the sea. I wish I could remember the sound of his laughter or the way his lips wrapped around my name. Sometimes I find myself Googling the circumstances of his demise in order to prove that he was real. I don't want the details of his death. I simply want to fill in the gaps of his face to make sure I am remembering him correctly. Justin is dead, and I'm not sure how to grieve him. I'm not sure how to make peace with everything that was left unsaid or how that death has made things better than they were. The woman I am now is not able to ignore the signs. Still, I don't know how to remember him without my throat tightening before I move down memory lane like things were always okay. I've yet to figure out how to pause and remember why we weren't together, those reasons beyond our youth and divergent paths. What I'm trying to grasp is how to temper what's left of him to grayscale instead of the technicolor my middle-age revisionism has painted him. I'm failing though, because now I've bled the color from the world to avoid feeling anything. I've reduced him to the stuff of legend, a photocopy of grief packed away inside a box, a photograph rescued from something broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Athena. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Everyone show some love for Athena there in the chat, if you would. That was beautiful and amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to put the link in here one more time to the book list. So great. All right, our last reader of the evening is Melissa Faliveno. Melissa is the author of the essay collection Tomboyland, which Publishers Weekly calls a winning debut in a starred review. The former senior editor of Poets and Writers magazine, Melissa's essays and interviews have appeared in Esquire, Paris Review, Bitch, Ms. Magazine, Elle, Prairie Schooner, and Diagram, among others, and received a notable selection in Best American Essays 2016. Melissa has taught nonfiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College and Catapult, and is the 2020-2021 Keenan Visiting Writer at UNC Chapel Hill. Born and raised in small town Wisconsin, Melissa joins us tonight from Brooklyn. Please, everyone, get those fingers tapping and show a little love for Melissa. Melissa, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Angela and Athena, for those readings. So good, so powerful. I just wanted you to keep going. I was like, no, you can't be done yet. Thank you, Brian, for having me tonight. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Yes, I'm going to read from my debut essay collection, Tomboyland. It is a collection of personal essays that also have like a little bit of reportage in them, but they're pretty personal. So I'm going to read one that's pretty personal tonight. It is about food, Midwestern food and sex, and my sort of like troubled relationship with vegetarianism. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I think you can probably connect the dots. So this essay is called Meat and Potatoes. When I moved from Wisconsin to New York, more than 10 years ago now, my new roommate analyzed my handshake. Casey and I were in graduate school together, and she quickly became known for this particular party trick. It was a way for her to flirt with women, to break the ice and talk about sex at house parties and bars filled with awkward writer types who were prone to standing against walls, clutching their sweating bottles of beer and talking to no one. It worked a little like palm reading. Casey would shake a person's hand, then begin a careful analysis, deciphering the firmness of the shake, the grip of the fingers, the stretch of the arm, the various movements of the shaker's hand and body, her eye contact, and a host of other bodily cues, and what it all meant about her personality, her sexuality, and ultimately, what kind of lover she'd be. A few weeks into the semester, in late September, Casey and I sat in our living room on a Saturday night, drinking beers, still getting to know one another. She was smart, gregarious, and very funny. She had a magnetic charm, and when she walked into a room, she commanded it. She was from the East Coast and had gone to an Ivy League school, and when I told her that I'd gone to college at the University of Wisconsin, a fact about which I'd only ever been proud, she asked, "Is that a state school?" She didn't mean anything by it, I don't think, but it was the first time I'd ever felt self-conscious about where I'd come from, a feeling that would become common in my new life on the coast. I was a small town Midwesterner from a working class family whose parents didn't have college degrees, let alone masters or PhDs, like so many people I would meet. Back home, I had felt smart, driven, and accomplished. In New York, I felt unremarkable at best and backwoods at worst. For the first time in my life, I felt the parameters of class and where I fit within them. That night in our living room, after spending the first few weeks of school curiously watching Casey do the handshake trick to other women in our program, I asked her to do it to me. I extended my arm and shook her hand. It was a Midwestern handshake, a masculine handshake, firm and strong and succinct, the kind I had learned from my father. In the Midwest, you learn early to never trust anyone with a weak handshake. Casey held on to my hand for a few seconds, looking at me. Then she nodded, one side of her lips curling into a grin. "Meat and potatoes," she said. Casey had an arsenal of words and phrases she returned to often in this game, titillating ones like dominant, submissive, versatile, or tops from the bottom, but I'd never heard this one before. It felt like an insult. "What does that mean?" I said, snatching my hand away. "Nothing bad," she said with a laugh, "just that there's no pretense. You put it all out there." "So what?" I said, unconvinced. "I'm like vanilla or something?" "No, no, no," she said. "You're a straight shooter, salt of the earth." This made some sense. This I'd been called before, but I still wasn't satisfied. I couldn't help but think Casey was calling me the furthest thing from what I believed myself and my sex life to be. Basic, boring, utterly normal. "What you see," she said, "is what you get." The first time I got whipped, it didn't feel euphoric. People who find pleasure in pain often liken it to a runner's high, that late burst of endorphins, and then ecstasy that carries you to the end of a long, painful act. When something that hurts suddenly becomes a swell of exhilaration, a full body buzzing of joy. It wasn't like that for me. Not at first, anyway. At first, the pain was just pain. It hurt and kept hurting. It didn't feel anything like pleasure. I gritted my teeth, tensed my muscles, flinched with every stroke of a whip, every smack of a cane, every dull thwack of a flog. My whole body braced itself against the electric shock of the violet wand. I resisted the pain. It didn't turn me on, but I never used my safe word. I kept saying yes. When you grow up in the Midwest, or at least where I did, in the rural, mostly white, working class Christian part, you grow up eating meat. In my house, and in most of the houses I knew, dinner consisted of two main ingredients, meat and potatoes. Dinner was pot roast and potatoes, pork chops and potatoes. It was chicken or turkey and mashed potatoes. It was barbecued ribs, hamburgers, hot dogs, and brats with potato salad. It was Friday night fish fry with fries or baked potato. On takeout night, it was a burger and fries from A&W or Hardee's, fried chicken and mashed potatoes from KFC. On special occasions, it was steak and a foil-wrapped potato on the grill. Inside the 6-foot freezer in our garage was a quarter cow, which we bought from my second cousin each Christmas, grown and slaughtered and sliced into various cuts, grounds, and rounds on the family farm just over the Illinois border. Every roast, ribeye, T-bone, and strip, each package of hamburger and chuck was wrapped tightly in thick white paper, stacked neatly on each snowy shelf for my mother to linger over, select, extract, and eventually cook, for as far back as I can remember. And this is what fed our family. The thing is, I hated meat. Unless it was slathered in gravy, stirred into a thick sauce and poured over pasta, squashed thin between bready buns and smothered in ketchup, or folded inside the creamy contents of a casserole, slow-cooked chili or stew, so tender that it was merely a suggestion, a conduit for whatever carbohydrate-loaded carriage, whatever glorious, gluttonous medleys of salt and starch I really enjoyed consuming. A big chunk of meat on my plate was enough to make my hungry heart sink. I rarely objected, though. Where I come from, you eat what you're given and you clean your plate. My parents had both been beaten for not finishing food, my father with a barber strap and my mother with a hairbrush. And while I wasn't at risk of a beating, I had absorbed this understanding like salt to starch. So I chewed the proverbial fat, tearing into the flesh and choking down the gristle, pressing my fork into the tender flank of a bloody steak and trying my best not to think about the animal I was eating. At first, masochism seemed at odds with my budding identification as a feminist. Being hurt at the hands of men in particular seemed like the opposite of everything I wanted to be. I'm not sure if I've ever been able to fully reconcile this. It was consensual and it was something that I was choosing, but it still felt at times like a betrayal. At the most basic level, I wanted to be dominated by men specifically, but also by women. Before getting involved in the BDSM scene, I always thought of myself as more dominant than submissive. So often, though, the things we hope to be true about ourselves and the things we really want are incongruous. In my Midwestern BDSM scene, play parties at people's houses always doubled as potlucks. Everyone brought a dish to pass, and in the kitchen of a suburban duplex or a farmhouse in the country, we'd gather around a table or a Marble Island counter filled with crock pots and Pyrex and platters of food, just like my family gatherings, except surrounded by half-naked bodies, modeled and read under a harness or corset, eating crudité and tater tot casserole, Swedish meatballs and cocktail wieners, chips and dip, cheese and crackers and slices of summer sausage. My ass raw beneath a PVC skirt, I talked to people who had just tortured me and each other about the weather, about school, about summer plans as I piled my paper plate with pulled pork, pasta salad, and chocolate chip cookies. Then, just like any Midwestern family gathering, we stood around those tables, sagging paper plates in hand, and ate. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was amazing. Wonderful way to like bring all the threads together. So
Right?
cool. Show Melissa some love in the chat. That was awesome.
Thanks.
I'm gonna put the link here one more time for book purchases. Support our authors. That was so cool. Well, we have a little bit of time for some questions, and so if you out there in the audience have a question for these three, you can use the chat there and type it in for us. Because yeah, you're in the presence of some masters. I was so struck by your I don't have a question here, just a comment, just from all three of you guys. I just was so struck by your word choice, and just how, I don't know, just how beautiful and intentional your some of the words you used in some of your verbs and your nouns and all that kind of stuff. I mean, like, does your sentencing, do you focus on the sentences as you're writing in your first drafts, or is that something that you, like, are you able to move forward with sentences that you're not super happy with because you know you'll go back and fix them over time and time, or are you the kind of writer who likes to get it just right before you can move forward, or something else entirely out of that dichotomy?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Athena.
I was gonna say, I'm the writer who doesn't move to the next line until I get that one right, just because I'm a poet before an essayist. And so I read everything aloud over and over again as I write it. So I might write a couple of lines and go back and read it from the beginning and do that until I build out an entire essay. Because it's important to me to hear whether or not there are sounds are too similar in lines that are too close together, if there's too many short lines versus long lines. And so I have to do it very much in real time, or I don't feel satisfied with what I'm writing.
That's interesting, because I'm the complete opposite, again, because of my journalism background. you know, in journalism, you're writing like 1,200 words a day. So I think very quickly you learn to just put down the words on the page, just let it be functional, and then you can go back. Oftentimes when I'm writing, whether it's an article or an essay or a book chapter, I really will just put lines like something, something quote here, or here, make the argument using X, and then I'll go back and fill it in instead of going line by line, because I think I would just get so in my head, I'd never be able to progress to the next paragraph.
I think I'm a perfect combination of those two. I do both, you know. I think that I have a tendency to really focus on the line level, and sometimes I get really caught up in the in like making sure that line is perfect before I move on. But I also have a bit of a background in journalism and reportage, so I can also kind of do the thing where I get it all out first and then go back and edit. And I think that my process now has kind of become a pretty integrated version of those two things, sometimes for better or worse, you know?
That's cool. Yeah, I feel like I sometimes can feel like procrastinating if I get too hung up, but then other times I feel like I wish I had gotten hung up on a line. But yeah, it's interesting that thinking of approaching the essay as from a poetry background and thinking of approaching the essay from a journalism background, and the differences in approach or in habit that might bring. It's really interesting. Other questions? If you've got a question, type it in. Don't be shy, or else I'm just going to keep asking my questions. I mean, I have a question for you guys that are, and Angela, this is maybe less like, well, you can interpret this either in terms of the book or a chapter, but I mean, I just am so interested about thinking about conclusions, and I feel like conclusions of essays are such for me, one of the hardest parts. And I wanted to know, how do you know when you've arrived at the end of a piece, or what are you looking for the end of a piece to do? Like, you know, so you're like, cool, it's doing what I want to do. I'm there.
That's tricky for me because I don't think I have like one process. I've thought about this question a lot, but I think that sometimes for me, I have a lot of like vignettes in my essays. So I'll like write a section and break it up and break it up and break it up. And then I have all these sort of like moving parts. And so sometimes for me, an end is just kind of moving the parts around and figuring out all the places the puzzle pieces need to go, and like, okay, this actually would be a really cool way to end it. And then I'll like move that section to the end. But then sometimes I think there's also like, I feel like I'm kind of working towards something, and each step is like compounding on this idea or question that I'm asking. And often I'll get to the end. It's like I just know that I've asked as many questions as I can ask for that one particular thing, you know, and I usually just end on a question or sort of like a rephrase of the question. Yeah, I don't know if that's kind of abstract, but
yeah, but well, it's interesting to hear that sometimes like the ending you might have written it already, and then it's just a matter of realizing that. That's a really helpful thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Athena, what about you?
I think for me, I'm always looking for the breadcrumb that I left myself from the beginning of the essay, and trying to find like that thread back to it. So like in that piece that I just read, my idea was like, it's how I felt like there was like that ending image of the photograph, which was mentioned a couple of scenes prior. Like then I'd want to make sure that image echoes back. And it just sounds really probably new agey, but I feel when things sing at the end, if I feel like I've lulled myself into the immersion of the piece, I know when it's hit kind of like that sweet spot. But my go-to is always finding that common thread back to the beginning, to shoot somebody back to the opening so they want to kind of read and see where they found that thread in other parts of the scenes. But also when I lay out my essays, I lay them out in a way that I pick my through line, and then top level, I pick what scenes I want to be the vehicles for that through line. And then the bottom half of that arrow is the emotions that I want to do for each one of those scenes. And so I have kind of a framework of how I want people to feel in each one of those particular sections. And so using that, I usually can get to an ending image that kind of brings them all together.
That's really cool. Cool to hear about your visual planning too. That's really neat. Angela, what about you?
I think for me, it's pretty much the same as Melissa's. Oftentimes, a lot of the work that I do, whether it's an essay or a book chapter, there's sometimes a narrative. And so it, the ending will maybe be the end of that chronology, or it'll be like the like emotional payoff for that. And oftentimes, again, as Melissa said, like I'll be making an argument and then it'll be like the conclusion, the argument, and all the threads of it coming together.
A question from Audrey, a great question that builds right off of that, which is like, what systems do you have for keeping track of those various threads and inquiries when you're working on a longer form project? Angela, you might be a good place to start, since you talk about a book, like especially when you've got these kind of different things that you're braiding together in the longer narrative.
The very concrete answer is I use Scrivener, and then I just put everything there, and I'm always moving it back and forth. And so I think that is, yeah, like when I was thinking about structure, I use that software a lot. And then I also like very heavily outline. Like I not only outline the book, but I outline every chapter. And so I often also do color coding, so like this thread, is it reappearing enough times throughout so it feels like it's building, or is it not working because I start an idea at the beginning and you never see it again until the end, and by that time you've forgotten what the point was from the beginning. So yeah, Scrivener and color coding outlines.
I've heard so many good things about Scrivener. I was just seeing Sari Botten on Twitter was asking people about it, and it was so interesting to hear it sounds like a really cool program.
I've never used it, but I've heard good things about it too.
Yeah.
I do like, what I'll do is generally I use a notebook, and I just I outline in a notebook. I have a bunch of basically field notebooks, and I just I'll outline it after I've completed a draft generally, and be like, this is what each section is dealing with. And that helps me sort of retroactively make sense of the threads that I'm working on, and to be able to identify okay, I need to bring out this thread a little bit more, or this thing seems kind of peripheral. Do I want to connect it, or do I want to cut it? Is everything making sense together? So really it's once I've typed it all up, I then kind of do a really crude outline of each thread, each sort of thematic thread or subject that I'm dealing with, and then look at it on that page and make sure that they're all sort of functioning.
I think for me, I mentioned the last question about doing kind of my arrow outlining, but I also, depending on the genre of the project, it changes how I format things. So if I'm writing fiction, I'm very much a person who's outlining out scenes individually and figuring out what happens within those scenes, who's in those scenes, and kind of where we're moving and transitioning to the next one. It's a personal essay, kind of just no research, no journalism, anything like that. Just a straight memoir-based essay. I use the same tricks I use in poetry, which is I write it and then I try to remember what I wrote. And if there's things that don't stick out, then I think whether or not they need to be in that particular draft. It's almost trying to write it from memory to see what actually sticks. And then those for me are the things that I need to concentrate on.
That's cool. It's so interesting hearing about all the outlining too that happens. Another great question here from Tara. With a journalism background, how does Melissa feel about changing any aspects of creative nonfiction? One of the things I most struggle with, especially with memoir, is writers who compress time or change details about people that they say aren't important, and so it's okay. And this is for everyone as well. But Melissa, maybe you could start.
Yeah, I'm just going over it one more time. That's a great question. Want to make sure that I get it all. There's one really great thing about the Zoom chat, like being able to like read the question after it's posed. That's a really great question, and one that I was just having this conversation with my students not too long ago about like specifically about creating like composite characters in nonfiction and changing details and sort of messing around with chronology. And some of my students who are undergrads were like, that makes it nonfiction. And I was like, does it? Because we're just relying on our memories for the most part. Like, who's to say that, like one person's memory one person's memory is a different truth than another person's memory. So what we're doing as nonfiction writers, as personal essayists, memoirists, is I think we're just trying to tell the truth as far as we can tell it. But for me, it does sort of, creative nonfiction introduces this like ability to, mess around with time. The key for me is naming it on the page when I do it. So I feel like I'm being more honest if I say like, I don't remember how this went, or something like that. So you're actually like making it apparent on the page that you don't remember, or some trick that's like, in my memory this happened, but I don't know if that was true, or something like that, so that you're kind of making the statement that like, I'm not actually stating this as like objective fact. I'm telling it as far as I can. I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but I think maybe.
Well, I'm definitely writing it down as well. I mean, it's so interesting to me. The term creative nonfiction just has that tension built into it, right? The truthiness of nonfiction and the imaginativeness of creativity, right? So
yeah. Tell the truth, but tell it slant,
Yeah. Angela, what about you?
I think for my own writing, I don't think that's something that I would do. 10 years in newsrooms has just trained me in a certain way. And I think that I can see a point where I would feel more comfortable. But right now, I'm just like, I would wake up at night sweating. At the same time, I can see, why people do it. I don't judge anyone for it. I think that when we have this conversation, I just wish it were more widely known that people do this. Like, I think the problem isn't that people create, composite characters or that they compress time. I think the problem is that some people know that memoir has these elements, some people don't. And when they're reading it as if it was a work of journalism, just maybe more lyrically written. And I think that's where the sense of betrayal comes in. So for me, it's almost like norms. Like if everyone knew this is what we do, then I just don't see it as a problem. So in a way, it is, for me, it also is about naming it, though in a more kind of structural, big picture way.
Athena, what about you?
I think for me, as a person who, again, writes mainly memoir and strictly personal essay, I approach it very similar to Melissa. I make it a point to say within the bodies of those individual essays, like, I cannot recall, or I remember, or something that gives you like a clue of this is not maybe exactly what happened, but because now time has passed and this is like an emotional memory, because it is coming through this lens of emotion, this is how I perceived it. But I also make it a point, a lot of my essays don't have dialogue as well for that very specific reason. The dialogue that does appear in my book is because those things were so life-changing and impactful that I remember them very specifically, but I don't include conversations because I don't want anyone who may see themselves in a particular piece to come back and say, well, that's not how the conversation really went. So I pick the things that I remember specifically or things that I said specifically. And I also never write composite characters. Every single person who I write about is an individual. And there's no like mixing of one person and making some kind of like, for me, like a super ex-husband. I'm like, no, everybody is who they are. But I also do make a conscious choice not to include people's real names or any identifiers that will make it very obvious who they are. For the most part, if you know who I'm speaking about, you know particular situations, and you may have a connection to it, but I make it a point to kind of frame everything that I write and the experiences that I write from my perspective only. as a kind of a retelling or like an unloading, and not putting the burden of those memories and those stories on the other people. That it's not my position to kind of like tell their side of the story, because that's not, it's not my position.
Yeah, it's so interesting how this question, which is a craft question, gets at issues of like, right, like kind of the um, uh, morality in a way, like what responsibility you have as an author to the people that you're writing about, what responsibility you have to your readers about the stance that you're taking and what you're representing on the page.
Mm-hmm.
It's really fascinating. It seems it's how craft is a part of these decisions that we make about how our work interacts with the world. It's fascinating to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. That was a great question. Thank you, guys. This has been really, really wonderful. And it's wonderful to hear each of you read, Angela and Athena and Melissa. And so wonderful to hear each of you talk about your craft. And thank you for just diving right in. That was really, really exciting. Thank you guys in the audience for being a great audience and for asking such great questions. I'm going to put a link up here. I have another, this schedule this season, this fall season is very staggered because of everything going on in the world, and I'm working around. And but next week, I will be doing a very Halloween themed event. There's a book launch for the collection Tiny Nightmares, which is very short tales of horror. And that's in collaboration with Word Bookstore. And there'll be Meg Ellison, Rachel Heng, Troy L. Wiggins, and Stephen Graham Jones will be reading. So you can click on that link there if you want to be a part of that. And then coming up even further afield is on Thursday, November 19th, kind of like a literary superstar event here with Ayad Akhtar, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright and novelist. His latest Homeland Elegies is just out. Nicole Krauss, who first story collection To How to Be a Man, and Jonathan Lethem, whose 12th novel, The Arrest, is just about to come out. If you want to be a part of that event, email me. You can find my information on my website, or contact me through Twitter, because that's a little bit unusual. It's going to be live streamed to YouTube, but the room itself will be exclusive, just because there are some security concerns around some of the authors involved. But anyone who's here tonight, please, you're welcome. So just come, let me know, and I will send you the registry information, because it's going to be a really great event and a chance to talk to some people who don't do many events. But a big thank you to tonight's readers again, Angela, Athena, and Melissa. And thank you to a great audience for being here. And thanks to the Literary Hub. This will be archived on their virtual book channel. So until next time, everybody, stay healthy, stay optimistic, and keep reading books. Thanks, everyone.